Please join me in welcoming Victoria Turk.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much for everyone for coming. Thanks for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm Victoria Turk. I am an editor at Wired UK, and I've also just written this book, Digital Etiquette, which is out this week. Before I go any further, I just wanted to make a quick confession, which is that this is the very first talk I've given about this book. And in fact, it's pretty much the first talk I've ever given about anything. So you guys are my guinea pigs. And if my knees look like they're shaking, it's probably because they are. But anyway, also, it is the first PowerPoint presentation I've made since like high school. So I haven't used any clip art, but I might have got a little bit carried away with the animations. It's actually a Keynote. Keynote didn't even exist when I was at high school, I think. Anyway, so what is digital etiquette? Well, the idea behind this book was basically a fun, modern take on the traditional etiquette guide for digital communications. And I think a lot of people, when they think about this term etiquette, it sounds very old-fashioned and kind of stuffy. But actually, I think it's super important. It is the social glue that makes it possible to communicate with each other without accidentally offending someone. And we all kind of do it, whether otherwise or not. And I think it's especially important online and in digital communications for several reasons. Firstly, because most digital communications are text-based. That means you're very limited in terms of the tools that you have to get your point across. You've probably all had that situation where you meet someone only over email, and you kind of get the impression that they're very terse and very brusque and kind of rude because their emails are always really short. But then you meet them in person and they're absolutely lovely and really nice. So I think for that reason, digital communications can be full of particular pitfalls when it comes to etiquette. Also, they're obviously rarely truly private. Even if you think you're just talking to one person, your conversation could easily be shared more widely. And they leave a digital trail. So that angry email you send at 3 in the morning is going to be in someone else's inbox forever once you've sent it. So this is a saying you've probably heard on the internet: no one knows you're a dog. But that's no excuse for poor manners. Now, the book covers 4 different chapters, each of which is dedicated to a different sphere of modern life. So there's the workplace, romance, which is obviously a lot of online dating, friendship, and community, which is social media. And it would be impossible for me to attempt to cover all of those here today. And given that this is, for most of you, your place of work, I thought we'd focus on the workplace and specifically on how to do email. Now, I do realize the absolute conceit of me coming into Google and trying to tell you how to do email. But the last I checked, you don't have a chief etiquette officer. So, maybe I can bring up 1 or 2 points that are of use. And actually, just to see what I'm dealing with, let's start with a quick question. Let's talk about email sign-offs. I want you to think about your default email sign-off, the one you use 90% of the time. You type it without even thinking. Who uses best wishes? Someone over there? Anyone use best or all the best, kind of variations on a theme? Quite a few, great. Who uses anything else? Okay, it's worse than I thought, because you guys are wrong. But we'll get to email sign-offs and the details of actually writing an email later on. First, I want to step back a bit and just think about the bigger picture of email etiquette. My driving philosophy behind email etiquette comes from one pretty universal truth. Everyone hates email. Again, maybe not the best place to be saying this, but I'm sure there's a few of you out there. Now, don't get me wrong, email is a fantastic innovation. There's a reason we all use it, and we still use it decades after it was invented. It lets us communicate with people on the other side of the world, in different time zones, And it's really actually reshaped workplace culture. I don't think it would be possible to work remotely if we didn't have email. So it is, a really great thing, and it is often very convenient. However, it's also stressful, time-consuming, annoying, and it often feels like it no longer just helps us to do work, it actually is work. You don't see many job ads where in the listing they put, the skills required, being really good at email. And yet I've spent whole days in my inbox just writing and responding to emails. I don't think anyone really wakes up full of a sense of joy at the number of unread messages they've got in their inbox in the morning. I think you probably feel more of a sense of dread. At least I hope I'm not the only one. In fact, I know I'm not the only one because there have been studies that have shown this. One of my favorites was actually a really small study, but I really liked it because they actually put heart rate monitors on a bunch of office workers. And they made them go about their daily business, and they tracked their email usage. And they found that the more people spent on email in a given day, the more stressed they were and the less productive they felt. I think we can probably all relate to that. So based on that, given that email is terrible and everyone hates it, the main principle of good email etiquette is to reduce it as much as possible. Every time you send an email, you are asking to take up someone else's time and mental energy. So obviously that means you should only send emails when you actually need to, but when you do, you also want to make sure that you're making it as easy as possible for your recipient to deal with. You want to make sure you're including all the information the first time round, so you're sending one email and not 10, and you just want to make it very clear. You want to be concise and precise, take up as little time as possible, and make it as easy to deal with as possible. And often, the best email is actually the one you don't send. So, that said, sometimes you do need to email. Sometimes it is a good thing. And email has become, for many workplaces, the default means of communicating, certainly in office-based workplaces. That is changing a bit, at least for internal communications. I know a lot of offices use instant messaging tools like Slack. I'm sure you guys probably use Google Hangouts. I'm getting lots of nods. Yep. But certainly for external communications and still a lot of internal communications, email is king. It's the thing you kind of just automatically go to first. But maybe you shouldn't always, because the very same things that make email really good for some things make it really bad for others. So what is email good for? It's good for distributing information, especially if you need to send a message to lots of people at once, especially if it's quite a long message, maybe you need to attach documents, perfect. Simple back and forths. Keyword there is simple, but if you want to have a quick question, answer with someone, it can work. If you have too many people on a thread or the thread goes on for too long, it can very quickly get confused. So simple is key. Starting a paper trail. I think this is particularly important if you're working on a project that you know is going to take quite a long time. One really good thing about email is it's really easy to search. It's not so easy to search back old instant messages and things like that, but you can find an old email from days ago, weeks ago, months ago, even years ago, very easily. So great. But more importantly, what is email not good for? It's not good for immediate responses. This is actually a bit of a controversial one, because I think certainly today a lot of people expect immediate responses or near immediate responses from email. But going back to the whole nature of email in the first place, the whole point of it is that it is asynchronous. Okay, so you can send an email at one time and your recipient can pick it up whenever they like. You could send it one evening, they pick it up the following morning. That is one of the major benefits of email. We'll get on to how fast you should be expected to respond soon, but I do hold that if you're looking for a really immediate response, you shouldn't be relying on email. Discussion and debate. I can't emphasize enough that email is not a discursive medium. I know the one thing people hate more than email is meetings, but if you have some kind of problem, especially if you need to work as a group to come together to create a solution or come to some conclusion. Email is just way too open for miscommunications in that situation. So it might be better just to speak in person. And nuance. I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, the thing about digital communications is it can be very hard to get your meaning across, and especially to get any kind of sense of your emotional meaning across. So if it's a situation that's a bit sensitive, you probably want to be choosing a format where you can use those nonverbal cues, like tone of voice, like facial expression, body language, to make sure that you're not misunderstood. And that's not only to make sure that you're coming across the way you want to, but also so you can pick up on those cues from the other person you're dealing with and maybe kind of tune your response along the way. So you've decided that you do need to send an email and that email is definitely the best medium. A key thing around email etiquette is timing. When to send an email. So obviously, I mentioned that email is asynchronous and that you shouldn't be expecting an immediate response. Expectations have changed hugely over the past decade because of smartphones. It's a pretty obvious point. It used to be that when you left the office at night, you'd leave your computer and you wouldn't be expected to check your email until the next morning. In fact, you probably couldn't. You couldn't even be tempted to because you had no means of doing so. Now, we've come to expect everyone to carry these mini computers in their pockets, and we expect them to be available 24/7. And this has really blurred the lines between work life and personal life, to the extent actually that France recently brought in a new law called the droit de la déconnexion, which is like the right to disconnect. And it essentially enshrines in law your right to ignore your boss's email on the weekend. Because they recognized that work life was just impinging on personal and family life, so that workers could never switch off. And I think if you wouldn't expect someone to be in the office that late working, you shouldn't expect them to be checking their email that late working. Okay, it takes just as much effort to do so. So I really think that you should stick to work hours or nearabouts. Okay, none of us are perfect. Maybe an hour or so either side. But try and stick to work hours, and try, if you want to be extra good, and stick to your recipient's work hours, especially if they're in a different time zone. Now you might say, that's great. I totally respect my colleagues' right to have a personal life and to not check their emails in the evening. But I, the super conscientious worker, I really like sending emails late at night, I actually enjoy it. And that way, I'm not keeping anyone waiting. They've got their answer as soon as they want it. And I feel good about myself. I can tick it off my to-do list and I'm done. The problem is, that goes back to the original paradox of email. There, you are enjoying the convenience of being able to send it at any time, but you're putting the stress on your recipient. Because even if you don't expect them to respond immediately, they're going to feel that unread email guilt. And they're going to be unsure about whether they're supposed to be replying right then or not. So the onus is on you as a sender to set a reasonable norm. And if you really want to be answering your emails late, you can also use the delay send function. So you can just schedule it to email the next morning. Which brings us to how fast must you respond to an email. And this is obviously the first thing that comes up whenever I bring up the idea of email etiquette with people. And what's really funny is that people have completely different views on this. And I think this is one of the main things that contributes to email stress in the first place, is that we don't have an agreed consensus on what we're supposed to be doing. So we're all just kind of scrabbling around, trying to please everyone, and no one knows what they're supposed to be doing. Now, it's easy to say good etiquette is to respond to an email as fast as possible. Usually if someone's emailed you asking something, they want a fast response. But it obviously is just so context dependent. It could be something really simple that you can respond to right away, or it could be something that actually requires quite a lot of work, and that you might not be expected to respond for several days. So it's a bit of a cop-out answer here. There is no one-size-fits-all, but there is a sort of workaround, a cheat. Ask them. So yeah, I think a lot of people assume that etiquette has to be this sort of unspoken thing, a kind of secret code that everyone else but you knows. But I am very much pro being transparent and being very practical. So if you receive a message and you don't know what you're expected to do with it, just send a quick line back. Say, hi, is it okay if I get back to you in this by Friday? Or, hey, this is going to take me some work. When do you need it by? Easy. And fast replies are actually not always the best etiquette. I think a good example of this is if you're on an email which has been sent to a group of people. Say it's been sent to your whole team. I used to be this person who, at the beginning of my career, I really wanted to show how keen I was and how ready to work and eager I was to get involved with everything. So if our boss would send an email to the whole team asking for input, I'd immediately jump in with my 2 cents. And I thought, I was just showing how great I was, what a good worker. Actually, obviously, I was just being super annoying. I think in that situation, it's much better etiquette to sit back, wait a while, see what other people say, see if your input is even needed. And if it is, when you do respond, you've then got all the information that you need. And I think not only is that good etiquette, but there's actually a lot of power in being able to do that and give kind of one very well-informed response. All right. How to write an email. I promise I'm not patronizing you guys. I honestly think this is really hard. I get it wrong all the time. I think everyone gets it wrong a lot. Everything, of course, goes back to thinking about your recipient and reducing the burden of email on them. So precision and concision are both your friends. And this is a quote from Merlin Mann. Does anyone know who he is? He's a speaker, a podcaster, a writer, and he coined the term inbox zero. Have you guys heard of inbox zero? Okay, quite a lot of recognition there. That's good. I won't go through exactly what inbox zero is in this presentation, but it's basically a way to stay on top of your email so that you don't drown in unread messages. I'm a huge kind of devotee to inbox zero. But anyway, Merlin was kind enough to speak to me for this book. And this is one thing he said, which I think really makes a good point when you're going to write an email. So he says, assume that everyone you're communicating with is smarter than you and cares more than you and is busier than you. Sounds kind of obvious, but I feel like we all almost automatically do the opposite. You sort of think, this is really important. Why haven't they responded? And obviously, it's better to just consider the other person. So writing an email, let's start from the top. Subject lines. Pretty simple. Keep it descriptive. Again, you're trying to make your email super easy to deal with. So you need something that helps people categorize it. And so they can see at a glance what it's going to be about and what probably the expectations on them are going to be. I've got a few examples of how not to do it. And I've used a scenario that I think everyone who works in an office will be familiar with. So here's our email. Hi all. Please can everyone remember that if you use a mug from the kitchen, it is your responsibility to wash it up. Has anyone ever received an email like that? Yeah. Now you'll notice in this email, there is no subject line. The subject line has been left blank. Don't do that. It's super annoying. When you go to check your email, you just see who it's sent from and there's no subject and you immediately assume the worst, right? You're like, oh God, I'm in trouble. I mean, you could argue you're in trouble there, but yeah. So don't do that. Don't put the whole message in the subject line. I've seen people do this. I often see actually quite senior people have a habit of doing this. And again, it's super annoying, especially if you check your email on mobile. You only get the first few words. It's like, what am I supposed to be doing with that? The clickbait headline. Yeah, I've seen quite a few of these in my time, usually from PRs, trying to get my attention. Yeah, obviously it's just misleading, it's not very useful, and you probably think you're being really funny, but you're not. Oh, yeah, urgent, kitchen mess. Yeah, so it's okay to play the urgent card every now and then if it truly is urgent, if you need a fast response. But every time you play that card, you are devaluing it. I don't think many people would consider this an actual emergency. So be very judicious with urgent. And going back to the whole point of email etiquette as well, if it wasn't at least a bit important, you probably shouldn't be sending the email in the first place. So yeah. So this is what I've gone for. Kitchen mess. Yeah, it's totally boring, completely bland, and therefore absolutely perfect for a professional situation. So that's subject lines. How to start the email. This is pretty easy, so I won't spend too long on that. You don't need to greet someone every time, especially if you have a back and forth thread. So, obviously you might first say hi, but it's like if you're having a conversation. If you're having a quick back and forth email thread, you wouldn't say like, hi, how are you? Hi, I'm great. Hi, that's good. Hi, and what about yourself? Hi, yeah, good too, thanks. You just wouldn't do it, and you don't have to do it on email either. Once you've established the back and forth conversation, fine to omit it. I usually just as like a rule of thumb, if a day has passed, so you slept on it, I'll then kind of do a greeting again. Dear someone is not usually necessary unless the email is taking the place of sort of a formal letter. So if it's a cover letter for a job application or an official invitation of some sort, then you might want to use dear. It's 2019, you can probably use someone's first name. The exception I make is if they have a title that is not Ms., Mr., Miss, Mrs. So if it's something like Doctor, Professor, Lord, Lady, Madam, Sir, I would use the title the first time around just because some people are quite picky about that. And then when they respond, they'll probably sign off with their first name. You're on a first name basis, that's fine. But dear, not usually necessary. Hi is probably fine. Striking the right tone. I mentioned kind of several times already that this is truly difficult. Email is terrible for communicating emotion. For this reason, I actually am totally pro things like emoji, using lots of exclamation marks, whatever it is that helps you to express your emotional meaning and get your view across more clearly, I think is totally fine. Obviously, that's going to be a bit dependent on where you work and what your position is. If you're sort of a lawyer, smiley faces might not be appropriate. But, in the media world, usually totally fine. So anything that you can do to kind of be clear is a good thing. And again, striking the right tone is going to depend a lot on context. So you do have to kind of make a lot of judgment calls there. But there are a few stereotypical ways that people email that I've observed. And I think that everyone in this room will probably be able to recognize at least one person they know who does each of these. The boss emailer. So this is the concept of emailing like a CEO. And Katie Natopoulos, American digital journalist, she wrote this great piece about emailing like a CEO. What is that? It's when you respond right away, but just with like one or two words, like just okay. And she noticed that her boss did this. And it's also kind of a thing that a lot of tech CEOs are quite well known for. You probably know Amazon's Jeff Bezos. He's renowned for forwarding emails from customers to Amazon staff with not even a word, just a character, a question mark. Can you imagine receiving that? The horror. So yeah, emailing like a CEO. I spoke to Katie about this because she kind of did an experiment where she tried it for a week. And she said it was actually really great. It made her feel so much more productive. She really stayed on top of things. And she told me, she never realized before how much email hung over her like a little black cloud. So it definitely has its advantages. It helps you be able to kind of maintain your inbox zero if that's what you're working towards. But you have to exercise caution because there's a very fine line between being concise and being brusque, and being brusque and being rude. So it's a really difficult one to judge. And And there's a certain thing to be said about who is able to do this. It's called emailing like a CEO, and it tends to be people in senior positions who do it. And when you get higher up the pecking order, maybe you have a bit more license to actually just be a bit rude. So it really depends kind of where you are and whether you can get away with it or not. And if you work in something like customer relations or HR, there's a certain expectation on you that you have to be a bit sort of more gentle in your email tone. So that's the boss emailer. The corporate jargon waffler. And this is almost the opposite of the boss emailer, yet they have the same aspirations, right? So this is someone who sort of sees every email as an official missive to be carefully crafted. They probably read a lot of business books, and they're always into the latest sort of trends in thought leadership. And they try and use that in their writing. So they end up with things like this sort of stuff. You can probably tell from this I've never actually worked in a really corporate environment, but my partner, who's a management consultant, tells me that it is not that far off. So yeah, you've probably all received something like that, which means obviously absolutely nothing at all. Definitely one to avoid. Third type of emailer. I couldn't think of a name for this one, and that's the best thing I could come up with to describe it. And I now realize, obviously, there's that headline right next to me, and probably everyone could just take a picture and put it on social media. But that would obviously be terrible digital etiquette, so I'm sure you wouldn't do that. But yeah, so this I think is actually a really, it's a big phenomenon, and I think I have definitely been guilty of this in the past. I'm sure I will be guilty of doing it in the future. I think it's actually a very British thing where, especially if you get a little bit annoyed or a little bit worked up, instead of being rude, you kind of go overly formal in a way that looks ostensibly polite, but is actually just super passive aggressive. So instead of saying something like, can you get back to me soon? Perfectly normal and acceptable. You'd say something like, I would be much obliged if you could kindly respond to this message at your earliest convenience. Yeah. Has anyone ever done that? Yeah, we've got a few people confessing that one. So that's another one to be aware of. Before we move on, a few common email translations. I find it really funny that we all have these set phrases that we seem to use in email, and we wouldn't consider saying them anywhere else. It's just that kind of email language. And I think it's especially funny when I see the Gmail suggested automated responses, because they're always so spot on, because we all already just email like robots. So we'll just go through a few. Apologies for the delayed response. Yeah, it's just the law that you have to start messages with that, I think. I've tried not to. My hands just do it. Hope you're well. Yeah, there's really no need to ask after someone's health unless you have a reason to be concerned. We all know this is inauthentic and you don't actually want to know. Not sure if you saw my last message. Yeah, you definitely saw my last message. Obviously, what you mean with that is hey, why haven't you responded? Just following up. Yeah, we're always just following up, aren't we? No, you're never just following up. If you're just following up, why are you sending the email? Just ask the question that you need to be answered. Does that make sense? Of course it makes sense. You wouldn't be sending the email if it didn't make sense. If you would, you need to go back and start redrafting. Thanks in advance. Yeah, I'm going to talk about thanks in advance a bit more in the next slide. But yeah, obviously it's, again, going back to that kind of passive aggressive thing, doesn't really mean what it seems to on the surface. So back to what I asked at the beginning and email sign-offs. These are the ones I'll accept. Basically, best wishes or any variations on them. Why do I think they're a good email sign-off? They're inoffensive. They're formal enough without being overly formal. They're totally boring, again, which makes them just perfect for at least 90% of workplace communications. You're not going to offend anyone with the best wishes. What do I not like? Has anyone seen that one? I've seen that in the wild. Yeah, you've obviously taken a perfectly good sign-off, best wishes, and turned it into an utter abomination. Kind regards. A lot of people use this one. Does anyone use kind regards? You can admit it. We've got one over there. Yeah, we've got a few. You know, it's fine. It's probably okay. I just think it's a bit overly formal for most situations in the modern workplace. And I think when you do that and you go a bit too formal, it can come off as standoffish and a bit stuffy, and maybe not giving the impression that you quite want to give. Cheers. I use cheers all the time with my colleagues that I'm also friends with, and I think that's fine in an informal situation, but as your default sign-off, it's probably not appropriate. It's a little bit too informal. So it's just striking that balance. Thanks in advance again. And I've saved the worst to last because I really hate thanks in advance. Why do I hate it so much? Because it's, sorry, let me gather my thoughts. Okay, so it's just so presumptuous. Because that's not how gratitude works. You don't thank someone before they've agreed to do something, right? It's just saying like, oh, yeah, you realize that you have no way of getting out of this. So yeah, I hate thanks in advance. Definitely want to avoid thank someone after doing something. All right, so our email sign-offs. Great, so we've gone through pretty much all the main parts of doing an email, so you're ready to send it. One last thing, and actually I think this is, if you take one thing from this talk, let it be this. Let's all agree on how to use CC. I'm serious. So when should you CC on an email? So obviously this is when you're sending an email to all recipients. It's a very simple rule. There is a strict rule for this. The to field is for primary recipients of an email who are expected to respond. The CC field is for people who need to see the email for reference only and who are not expected to respond. Now, I didn't come up with this. I'm not reinventing the wheel. Do you know the big old-fashioned etiquette guide, Debrett's? The edition I have at home, it's got 2 pages in the whole thing dedicated to the whole of digital communications. That's about the same as it has for how to address a bishop. But even it includes this CC rule. That's how important it is. Why is it useful? You're just making very clear what your expectations on your recipients are. And so that is, again, reducing the burden of email stress on the world. If people are on CC, they know they don't need to respond. If they're in the to field, they know they have to. Obviously, the problem here is that not everyone may be aware of this rule. So what you can do to help kind of establish good email hygiene is if you send an email, you could just say so. You can just put something like, to those on CC, no need to respond. This is just an FYI. And then you don't end up in that kind of awkward situation where you've got people who you just included as a kind of courtesy, responding and turning it into this whole thread from hell. Actually, that's another point on CC. Like, when should you include people on CC? Obviously, the kind of top level rule of reducing email means you should only include people when it's necessary. However, people's feelings kind of trump that productivity. So good etiquette means taking other people into consideration. So if you're, for example, emailing a whole team of people, you really need to include them all. You can't just include half of them, even if not everyone is on a need-to-know basis. So I call that tossing a courtesy CC. It's like, oh, I'm including you, even though I don't really care. But yeah, just so no one feels left out. CC, however, isn't always a courtesy. Has anyone ever been in that position where someone emails you to ask you to do something, or maybe even complain about something you've done, and they so thoughtfully think to CC your boss? Yeah, that's not a courtesy CC. That should be avoided at all costs. It's not even passive aggressive, it's just aggressive. And the thing is, if you genuinely need to complain about someone, you should be going through the correct channels, right? You shouldn't be sort of doing this snide, like CC your superiors. It's like blackmail. It's like saying, if you don't respond to this email how I want you to, you're going to be in trouble. So don't do that. Now, there is, of course, an alternative to CC, BCC. It stands for blind carbon copy, as you all know. So if you send an email to someone and include someone on BCC, your original recipient can't tell that anyone else is privy to that conversation. That means it can be incredibly sneaky. And for that reason, it's usually very poor etiquette. And Debrett's actually covers this as well. It says if you need to loop someone in on an email conversation confidentially, you should forward the email to them with a note explaining why it's confidential. That way you don't get in one of those awkward situations where someone doesn't realize they were on BCC and not CC, etc., etc. But there are a few situations where BCC is not only acceptable, but very necessary to protect people's identities. So if you're emailing a whole group of people, you don't want to reveal their names and their email addresses to each other. Email it to yourself and put everyone else on BCC. This is super important. Sometimes it can even be a legal requirement. In 2016, there was a London NHS clinic that accidentally revealed the identity of hundreds of people who had used an HIV clinic because someone forgot to put them on BCC. So they were all looped in together. They were obviously fined lots for that. Hopefully, you guys aren't doing anything quite as sensitive as that, but it's still useful to use. To avoid a reply all apocalypse, do you all know what I mean if I say a reply all apocalypse? Yeah, when someone sends an email, usually to like an office mailing list, and they think it's just for their department, but it ends up being like the whole office and also all the global offices. And someone replies back and they're like, the classic, take me off this thread. And then everyone else does, and you end up with this huge pile up. So BCC, if you're emailing lots of people and you want to avoid that, it can be a useful tool because all the people who are on BCC are not able to reply all. They can only reply to the person who actually sent the email. Another example, also from the NHS actually, which apparently has some work to do on its email skills. They had, if you think, reply all apocalypses that you've seen have been bad, they had one, also in 2016, that affected the entirety of NHS mail, and it resulted in around 500 million emails being sent, because they were all sent to every other person with an NHS mail address. So yeah, it can be bad. To nobly save someone else's inbox. This is a quite specific situation, but it actually comes up all the time. So this is when someone emails you and a colleague with a request, and you say, oh, you know what, actually, I'm better placed to deal with this. No need for my colleague to be involved. So what you should do is respond to them, move your colleague to BCC, and say in the email something to the effect of, hey, I'm best placed to deal with this, moving Sally to BCC to save her inbox. And that means that Sally will then no longer receive any more emails on the thread. So it's the ultimate act of email self-sacrifice, right? You're taking on that thread and saying, actually, you don't need to be involved. Don't worry about it. So that's a really good thing to do. Okay, we're coming to the end now because I think we've covered most of the major points. Just as I was talking about a reply all apocalypse and using the all office email address, I thought I'd end. Obviously, if you've been paying attention, you should be able to work out for now that you should never really be using an all office email address unless you really have to. The 3 circumstances under which it is acceptable: a genuine emergency, an official announcement, and free food. Now, one of those is a joke. Can you tell which one? Genuine emergency. You shouldn't be emailing in a fire. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening. My name is Victoria Turk. Digital Etiquette, the book is out this week. That's my Twitter handle if you want to tweet abuse at me later. And I think we're going to have some questions.
Yeah, thank you very much first. So do have time for questions. Please go to the microphone in the middle of the room so we can all hear you. While you're going there, I have the first question, if I may. You talked about business email, work email mostly. Do you see any general difference between work email and personal email?
I have to say, I don't really know that many people who email in their personal lives that much anymore. Does anyone here email for fun? A couple. Obviously the rules are very different. It all goes back to kind of that context of how formal you need to be. If you're actually genuinely friends with people, you can be a lot more kind of freely spoken, and you don't have to abide by the rules so much. I think the really interesting thing about email actually is that it can kind of take the place of several different things. It used to be very much used like a snail mail letter. Now it's often used more like a text message. And I think in your personal life, you're probably going to be doing more of the latter. But yeah, use loads of emojis would be my advice.
All right, so let's start with the assumption that all of the people in the room now are able to craft the perfect emails and send them at the right times, and like we're all going to be good. But how do we actually deal with receiving emails that are not appropriate? I mean, how do we actually respond to the thanks in advance, to the emails sent at night, and how do we encourage people to like follow the digital etiquette? Without
that's a really
sounding
good
pretentious.
question. Yeah, I mean, obviously it would be quite poor etiquette if you went off at your colleague for using thanks in advance. So there's not much you can do on that one except for kind of, silently enjoy the feeling of self-worth you get from doing it better. For emails sent at night, I think workplaces on the whole should establish kind of better codes of conduct when it comes to email. It is so often this thing that it's assumed that everyone knows how to do it and how to do it correctly. And actually, expectations just vary so widely that that's clearly not the case. So I think every workplace should have a kind of standard set of rules on when you're supposed to be emailing and not. It's really funny, isn't it? Because we all seem to assume now that we have smartphones and that we are technically contactable most of the time, that we need to always be on call. Like, I'm a culture journalist. There's not many emergencies where I'm going to be the person that someone calls. And yet even I'm like, oh gosh, I've got an email. I'd better check it just in case. I don't think that's ever been super urgent. But it is hard to get out of that mentality. So I do think as senders, you have to, the kind of onus to fix that is on you. If you're a receiver, obviously, if it's possible, just don't answer it. I think people get different expectations around different people based on your behavior as well. If they know that you're going to answer at 11 p.m. because you always do, they're probably going to keep doing that. Whereas if you establish that kind of routine where actually I don't answer my emails until 8:30 in the morning or 9 in the morning, then they may end up respecting that without you having to actually say anything.
Hi, thanks for the talk. So on the subject of email sign-offs, one option which you didn't mention is how about having no sign-off at all? That's something I do sometimes when, like, if it's replying to an existing conversation or a colleague I know well, it's just faster.
Yeah, I'd say that's similar to the greeting at the beginning. If you're having a back and forth with someone, you don't need to sign off. And I often actually just sign off with the letter V, the first letter of my name. And I think in that context, that's fine. The first email you send, I think you do need to sign off. Again, obviously, if it's a more sort of acting more like a letter than a text message, then you need to sign off. But I don't think there's anything rude about having no sign off if you're treating it like a back and forth conversation. I think that's fine.
Hey, thanks for coming. You talked about email in a professional environment. I'm sure that in the book you also talk about personal relationships, as you said. Can we hear your thoughts on what we call the dictatorship of the blue tick? You know, like when you send a message, someone sees that you saw it.
I have such strong thoughts on this.
You watch someone's story on Instagram and they're like, I know that you watched it and you didn't say anything, and then there's like, what am I supposed to do?
Yeah, being left on read is excruciating, right? When you can see someone's read your WhatsApp and they haven't bothered to respond, and you're like, but you had time to check it. what do I think about that? I think you shouldn't leave people on red. I think we probably shouldn't be so neurotic about it, but I don't know how to fix that. I'm terrible for this. I read so much into those little blue ticks. So I think if I relate it back to inbox zero, which I mentioned earlier, part of the rules of inbox zero is if you check your inbox, if you check an email, you have to have time to do something about it. There's no point looking at it if you know you're not going to be able to do anything about it, because then you're just going to have to read it twice, and you've kind of doubled the amount of time spent on it. I think it would be good to apply a kind of similar idea to your WhatsApp messages. If you're checking them, you should have time to answer. And that way you don't end up leaving people on red. And again, it could be the same, if it's someone kind of trying to organize a dinner and asking you lots of dates and you need to check your calendar, you can just respond like, oh, I'll check this later. But that way they at least know that you've seen their message. Because that's the thing about the blue ticks is we used to, before you had them, someone could see your message and not respond to it. But you wouldn't be so bothered about it because you could invent all these myths about why they hadn't responded. Like, oh, they haven't checked their phone. Oh, they're probably really busy. Oh, maybe they died in a ditch. But when you see the blue ticks, you know they've actually seen it. And that's what's so irritating.
You acknowledge that most of us don't use email for personal stuff anymore. Do you think that's entirely a good thing, or there's cases, for example, like planning a holiday or something? Would a WhatsApp group or an email thread be better for that?
That's an interesting question, because I just tried to plan a holiday with my family over WhatsApp, and we all fell out. It was a disaster. Would email have been better? For something like that, where it involves lots of discussion, I think the best thing is an actual conversation. Obviously, that isn't always possible. I suppose the advantage of email is you can include more information, you can put links to stuff and things like that. I just think I don't even know most of my friends' email addresses. So I just think it's not the kind of go-to communication for those more sort of friendly situations these days. Maybe it should be. Maybe we should try to revive it. I think maybe everyone's so put off email just from work email and it just being so terrible that I'm kind of loath to try to bring that into my private life.
Thanks.
Last chance for questions.
Thanks, good talk. Having sent email for decades and from a very nerdy sort of area, the majority of mails I dealt with were reply in line, with the chevron indentation moving, the thread was easy to follow.
Oh my God.
Outlook came along and the cursor flashed at the top, and sort of new generation of non-text started just replying top posting, and there's a different style of email arrived, and then you can't mix the two at all. Google, I thought I'd given up and the ship had sailed, but at Google it's surprising. There's a good 40% mails are reply in line still. It's like this has still survived as a thing, and I just wanted to know what your take on that was, and how, should I just give up and I'm just an old timer and I should just, or is this really, it can lead to quite a nice thread, a very good, easy way to follow what's going on. You're replying to specific bits, or, discuss.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually, because that, I think, is when things can go really wrong, it's when you mix the two, right? And so the thread goes completely out of control and it's kind of part chronological and then it skips something and you're like, what? I have to say, I think most people don't even think about this and they rely on the technology to do it for them. I'm not sure if I have a particular preference for one or the other. I think the problem is if you're mixing. So as soon as the thread is established in a certain way, you should just follow suit. That's probably the best answer I have on that one. Which do you prefer? Inline, yeah.
All right, we are at the end. So once again, thank you very much, Victoria Turk.
Thank you.